The radar operator's hand shook slightly as he stared at his screen on February 12, 1942, at 11:09 a.m. in Dover, England, watching three large contacts moving northeast through the English Channel at speeds approaching 28 knots. And he picked up the phone with growing certainty that something unprecedented was occurring, despite the impossibility of what he was seeing. When he reported multiple surface contacts bearing 045 at approximately 28 knots, the response from the other end of the line expressed the disbelief that every officer would feel upon learning that something that large was moving through the channel in broad daylight, because nothing of that size had attempted such a transit during daylight hours within living memory, and naval doctrine considered it tactically insane. But something was indeed moving through those waters, and within hours the Royal Navy would experience one of its most humiliating defeats of the entire war, with three German capital ships, including the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, along with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, preparing to sail through the narrowest point of the English Channel in broad daylight, passing Dover and the famous White Cliffs, where every British child could point across to France on clear days, transiting waters that the Royal Navy had controlled for 3 centuries, and considered essentially British territorial seas where enemy capital ships simply didn't operate. The operation bore the codename Cerberus, after the three-headed dog guarding the gates of hell in Greek mythology, a name that reflected German understanding of exactly what they were attempting and their recognition that the British would do everything in their power to stop this brazen transit through what amounted to the Royal Navy's home waters. The Germans were absolutely correct about British determination to prevent the transit, because Britain would throw everything available at those ships, including 242 aircraft and 6 destroyers and dozens of motor torpedo boats and coastal artillery from Dover's strategic positions. But the result would prove devastating for British forces rather than German vessels. The final accounting would show 42 British aircraft shot down and 6 motor torpedo boats sunk and 17 airmen killed, with hundreds more wounded, creating casualty figures that seemed incomprehensible given that 0 German capital ships were sunk during the entire operation. By nightfall, on February 13th, all 3 German ships would reach their home ports, battered and damaged by mines, but fundamentally afloat and intact and victorious in what would be remembered as one of the most audacious naval operations of World War II, though one whose strategic implications would prove far more complex than the tactical outcome suggested. The story begins not with the operation itself, but with the strategic situation that created the necessity for such a desperate gamble, starting in Brest, France, on February 11th, 1942, at 10:30 p.m., when Vice Admiral Otto Ciliax stood on the bridge of Scharnhorst, looking out at a French harbour that was dark and silent after 15 months, during which these 3 powerful ships had been trapped and bottled up by the Royal Navy blockade, while being bombed repeatedly by RAF Bomber Command in operations that sought to destroy or disable them. Ciliax knew the grim statistics showing that since April 1941, the RAF had flown 972 sorties against these ships and dropped thousands of tons of bombs, achieving hits on Scharnhorst 3 times and Gneisenau 5 times, and Prinz Eugen once, representing an expensive commitment of resources that had proven only moderately effective because the ships remained operational and dangerous and capable of threatening Allied operations. Hitler now wanted these ships home, not for rest or repair, but for redeployment to Norway, where they could threaten Allied convoys running to Murmansk and tie down British Home Fleet units that could otherwise be used elsewhere, creating a strategic reorientation that would remove these vessels from Atlantic operations but position them to interdict critical supply lines to the Soviet Union. Two routes existed for escaping from Brest, with the first being around the north of Britain through the Denmark Strait, representing a week-long voyage through waters that were crawling with British warships and submarines, while the alternative was the short route through the English Channel, covering only 350 miles, that could be transited in approximately 14 hours at high speed. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder had recommended the northern route as being safer and more predictable, with lower risk of catastrophic losses. But Hitler overruled him with characteristic decisiveness and insisted on the Channel route based on his calculation that speed and surprise would prove decisive, and that British doctrine and psychology and naval tradition would blind them to the possibility of a daylight dash through the Channel. Hitler's strategic intuition proved remarkably accurate in this instance, because the British would indeed fail to anticipate or adequately prepare for such an audacious operation, despite having ample forces in the area to intercept and destroy the German squadron if those forces had been properly positioned and coordinated. Ciliax received his final orders at 11:00 p.m. on February 11th, with departure scheduled for 10:45 p.m. to take advantage of high tide and new moon conditions, providing maximum darkness for the critical first phase of the operation, when detection would be most likely and most dangerous. The plan demonstrated elegant simplicity in its conception, with the squadron sailing under cover of darkness and exiting Brest undetected, so that by the time British reconnaissance spotted them at dawn, they would already be past Cherbourg and moving at full speed of 30 knots while surrounded by a defensive screen, unlike anything previously attempted in naval warfare. The escort force totaled 32 ships, including 7 destroyers and 14 torpedo boats and 25 minesweepers, providing layered defense against submarine and surface and mine threats, while air cover would be provided by 250 Luftwaffe fighters flying rotating patrols that ensured continuous protection throughout the transit, creating what amounted to a moving fortress that could defend itself against conventional attacks through concentrated firepower and coordinated defensive measures. At precisely 10:45 p.m. Scharnhorst slipped her moorings, followed by Gneisenau 8 minutes later, and Prinz Eugen at exactly 11:01 p.m., with all 3 vessels moving in single file down the harbour channel without lights and maintaining radio silence, while engines turned just fast enough to maintain steerage through the confined waters. By midnight, they reached open water, and by 1 a.m., they passed Ushant Island, and by 2 a.m., they were making 27 knots on a northeast course, heading directly toward the English Channel and the Royal Navy forces that should have been waiting to intercept them. Except that the British had no idea the operation was underway, because a series of failures in reconnaissance and intelligence assessment created the blind spots that allowed the German squadron to escape detection during the critical early hours when interception would have been most feasible. The failure that would ultimately define the entire operation began weeks earlier in the decisions and indecisions that created gaps in Britain's surveillance network around Brest, because while the RAF maintained continuous reconnaissance patrols over the harbour, using Spitfires with cameras and Hudson bombers with radar to photograph the anchorage twice daily and log every movement. The system contained vulnerabilities that German intelligence had identified through careful observation of British patrol patterns. On the night of February 11th, weather turned unfavorable, with low clouds and rain, and visibility less than half a mile, causing the evening reconnaissance sortie to be cancelled according to standard procedures that avoided risking aircraft when visibility prevented effective observation. The Germans had tracked British reconnaissance schedules for months and understood the patrol patterns and gaps and windows of opportunity, allowing them to time their departure for one of those windows when detection would be least likely. And by dawn on February 12th, the German squadron was already 120 miles from Brest, having passed well beyond Cherbourg and approaching the Cotentin Peninsula. The first scheduled RAF patrol took off from Plymouth at 6:30 a.m. with a Spitfire reconnaissance flight heading for Brest Harbour, and the pilot arrived over the target at 7:20 a.m. and photographed the harbour and saw nothing because the berths where the 3 capital ships had been moored for 15 months were empty, prompting an immediate radio message reporting that the targets had left harbour. RAF headquarters in London received this critical message at 7:48 a.m, and duty officers scrambled to locate the missing ships by issuing orders for every available reconnaissance aircraft and every coastal radar station and every ship at sea to search for the German vessels. But the critical question of where to search involved assumptions based on years of naval doctrine and strategic thinking. The British Admiralty made what seemed like a logical assumption based on centuries of naval tradition and tactical doctrine, concluding that capital ships simply don't sail through the channel in daylight, because such an operation would be tactically insane and suicidal, given that the waters were too narrow and too heavily defended and too easy to trap vessels attempting transit. Based on this doctrinal assumption, British planners concluded that the Germans must have left Brest during the previous night and were heading west into the Atlantic or north around Scotland under cover of darkness, leading to reconnaissance aircraft being dispatched to search the western approaches, while naval patrols were alerted to watch for ships attempting the northern route around Britain. No one initially looked east toward the Channel, because the possibilities seemed too absurd to warrant serious consideration, creating exactly the blind spot that German planning had anticipated and exploited through their understanding of British strategic thinking and operational doctrine. The first definitive sighting came at 10:20 a.m. when 2 Spitfires on a routine fighter sweep spotted something unexpected 20 miles off Le Touquet, observing a massive formation of ships moving fast on a northeast heading at approximately 28 knots. Squadron leader Gerald Kidd radioed immediately, reporting multiple surface contacts that were large and heavily escorted and heading 045 at high speed, with this message reaching RAF headquarters at 10:42 a.m., exactly 4 hours after the Brest patrol had reported the empty harbour. And those 4 hours represented time during which the German squadron had covered 112 miles and was now approaching the narrowest point of the Channel at the Strait of Dover, where England and France are separated by only 21 miles. The British response began immediately upon confirmation that German capital ships were indeed transiting the Channel, but coordination proved to be a nightmare involving different services with different command structures and different communication systems that couldn't easily share information or coordinate operations in real time. The RAF had squadrons on standby, including Bomber Command and coastal command and fighter command units, but getting them into the air and properly briefed and armed and directed to the target location required time that the rapidly moving German squadron wasn't providing. While the Royal Navy had destroyers stationed at Harwich and motor torpedo boats at Dover and submarines on patrol, but concentrating these forces at the right place and right time required precise coordination that the chaotic circumstances made nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the Germans had 250 fighters overhead, flying rotating patrols that ensured fresh aircraft were always available every 30 minutes, with Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s flown by the best pilots from Jagdgeschwader 2 and 26, providing defensive umbrella that would prove devastatingly effective against British attack aircraft throughout the day. At 11 a.m., the first British attack began when 6 Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers took off from Manston Airfield in Kent, representing what would become one of the war's most tragic and heroic episodes, as ancient biplanes with fabric-covered fuselages and maximum speed of 90 knots, armed with single 18-inch torpedoes, attempted to attack modern, heavily defended capital ships. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond led the formation, knowing that the mission was essentially suicidal, but accepting it because orders required execution and duty demanded courage regardless of odds, and the Swordfish approached their targets at wave-top height while German fighters dove on them and anti-aircraft fire from the entire German squadron concentrated on the slow-moving, vulnerable biplanes. All 6 Swordfish were shot down within approximately 8 minutes of beginning their attack run, with Eugene Esmond being killed, along with 12 other crew members, and none of the 18 torpedoes launched achieved hits on German ships, despite the extraordinary courage displayed by crews who pressed home attacks, knowing they would almost certainly die in the attempt. The second wave arrived at 12:15 p.m., consisting of 15 Bristol Beaufort torpedo bombers that approached from different angles, attempting to split the German defensive fire. But Luftwaffe fighters engaged them before they could reach launch positions and shot down 4 aircraft while forcing the remainder to scatter and launch torpedoes from maximum range where accuracy was minimal, resulting in all torpedoes missing their intended targets. At 1:30 p.m., 7 motor torpedo boats from Dover attempted coordinated attack, approaching at high speed from multiple directions while laying smoke screens to obscure their movements. But German destroyers intercepted them and engaged with concentrated gunfire that sank 2 boats and damaged 3 others, while the remaining 2 retreated after launching torpedoes that missed due to the long ranges at which they were forced to fire. At 2:45 p.m., 11 Hampton bombers arrived to conduct high-altitude bombing attacks, dropping 44 bombs from 8,000 feet. But the German ships maneuvered violently at high speed while maintaining tight formation, and all bombs missed, though one landed close enough to Prinz Eugen to cause minor damage from near-miss effects. At 3:15 p.m. 28, Wellington bombers attempted saturation bombing from high altitude, but weather was deteriorating with visibility becoming poor, and bombs fell in wide patterns that achieved no hits while one Wellington was shot down by flak. And at 4:01 p.m. 11 Beaufort torpedo bombers made another low-level attack that saw 4 aircraft shot down by German fighters, while the remaining 7 scattered and launched torpedoes from maximum range that all missed their targets. The largest attack came at 5:30 p.m. when 73 bombers, including Blenheims and Hudsons and Fortresses, converged on the German squadron, in a combined strike from every available squadron that was coordinated to overwhelm the defenses through sheer numbers. And in theory, this should have worked, because 73 aircraft attacking 3 targets from multiple directions should have ensured that some bombers got through even with heavy losses. But weather saved the Germans as cloud cover increased to 8/10 and visibility dropped to 2 miles, causing the bomber formations to lose cohesion and attack piecemeal in small groups that never achieved the concentration needed to saturate defenses, with the result being 39 bombs dropped and 0 hits on capital ships, though 1 destroyer was damaged while 7 bombers were lost. By 6 p.m., the German squadron had passed Ostend and was approaching Dutch waters, meaning the narrowest and most dangerous part of the channel was behind them, though they weren't yet safe because the British had one final weapon in the Dover coastal batteries mounting 9.2-inch guns, with 4 weapons positioned on the White Cliffs providing maximum range of 29,000 yards. These guns had been built specifically to deny the channel to enemy ships, and this represented their moment to fulfill that purpose. And at 6:18 p.m. the guns opened fire, launching 33 rounds at maximum range, though visibility remained poor, and targets were barely visible through haze that obscured accurate ranging. One shell landed within 30 yards of Prinz Eugen, close enough to drench her deck with spray, while the remainder fell short or wide, and the German ships responded by increasing speed to 31 knots and beginning evasive maneuvers, including zigzagging, that made them harder to hit, with the guns firing for 7 minutes before the targets moved out of range without achieving any hits. At 7:45 p.m., Scharnhorst struck a mine in a British defensive minefield off the Dutch coast, with the explosion tearing a 40-foot hole in her bow and flooding 2 compartments while reducing speed to 12 knots, creating a period of vulnerability lasting approximately 30 minutes when she was limping and presented a perfect target for concentrated attack. But no British forces were in position to exploit this opportunity because the attacks throughout the day had been disorganized and piecemeal, with each wave arriving separately and being defeated before the next wave could arrive, preventing the concentration of force that might have achieved decisive results. Scharnhorst's damage control teams worked frantically to seal flooded compartments and restore power, and by 8:15 p.m. she was making 25 knots again and continuing toward German waters, followed at 9:34 p.m. by Gneisenau, also striking a mine, though with less serious effects, including minor flooding that reduced speed to 20 knots for 15 minutes before she returned to full power. At 10:48 p.m., Scharnhorst hit a second mine aft, causing damage to the starboard propeller shaft that permanently reduced her speed to 22 knots. But by this point, it no longer mattered, because they were in German waters under protection of coastal batteries and within range of Luftwaffe bases, while British attacks had stopped due to darkness and exhaustion and lack of remaining forces to commit. At 7 a.m. on February 13th, Scharnhorst entered Wilhelmshaven, followed by Gneisenau, reaching Kiel at 9 a.m., and Prinz Eugen arriving at Brunsbüttel at 11 a.m., with all 3 ships intact, though battered and damaged, but fundamentally operational and victorious in what represented one of the most successful German naval operations of the entire war from tactical perspective. The British losses were devastating, both materially and psychologically, with 42 aircraft destroyed and 23 damaged beyond repair, and 17 pilots killed and 31 wounded, while 6 motor torpedo boats were sunk, and 2 destroyers heavily damaged, and 143 naval personnel killed or missing, creating casualty figures that seemed incomprehensible given that they hadn't sunk a single German ship or even inflicted serious damage until the mines struck near the end of the transit. The newspapers called it a national humiliation, with the Times running the headline, "The biggest naval blunder since 1066, while Parliament demanded answers and Churchill faced difficult questions in the House of Commons about how 3 enemy capital ships could sail through the English Channel in daylight and escape essentially unharmed. The inquiry that followed identified multiple failures, including radar gaps and communication breakdowns and lack of coordination between services and inadequate reconnaissance and poor weather and bad luck. But the real failure was psychological and strategic, because the British had assumed the Germans would never attempt something so audacious, and that assumption created exactly the blind spot that German planning had exploited perfectly. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, who conducted the official inquiry, wrote in his report that the enemy succeeded where Britain failed, because Germany made full use of essential elements, including surprise and concentration of force, while Britain dispersed efforts and reacted rather than acting proactively, with the Germans concentrating their defensive power, while British attacks came piecemeal and were defeated individually. But there exists a profound irony in this story that would only become clear months and years later as strategic implications unfolded in ways that contradicted the apparent tactical outcome. Because while Operation Cerberus represented a tactical victory for Germany through brilliant execution and minimal losses and significant propaganda triumph, strategically it proved to be a disaster that removed powerful assets from positions where they could threaten Allied operations. By moving those 3 ships from Brest to Norway, Hitler removed them from Atlantic convoy routes where they would never again threaten Allied shipping in the western approaches, and never again tie down massive British resources in hunts for commerce raiders that had forced the Royal Navy to commit capital ships to protecting convoys. In Norway, these vessels became defensive assets that were expensive and powerful, but fundamentally defensive in nature rather than offensive threats, spending most of the war in harbours tied to coastal positions while waiting for an Allied invasion of Norway that never materialized. Scharnhorst would eventually be sunk by HMS Duke of York off the Norwegian coast in December 1943. During the Battle of North Cape, Gneisenau would be bombed and damaged beyond economical repair in 1945, and Prinz Eugen survived the war only to be used as a target ship in the Bikini Atoll atomic tests, demonstrating that all 3 ships achieved relatively little after their dramatic escape through the Channel compared to what they might have accomplished if they had remained positioned to threaten Atlantic convoys. Admiral Raeder understood this strategic dimension and had argued against moving the ships from Brest because he recognized that concentration of force in the Atlantic represented more valuable strategic positioning than dispersal to Norwegian waters for defensive purposes. But Hitler overruled him with characteristic insistence on his own strategic vision, and in doing so won a battle while losing a strategic position that had been tying down substantial British naval resources. The Channel Dash thus represented Germany's greatest naval humiliation of the Royal Navy in tactical terms, while simultaneously representing Britain's greatest strategic victory disguised as tactical defeat, because the operation removed German capital ships from positions where they threatened critical Allied interests and placed them in Norwegian fjords, where they achieved essentially nothing for the remainder of the war. On February 13, 1942, in London, during a war cabinet meeting, Churchill sat at the head of the table while the mood remained grim, and newspapers screamed about the humiliation, and Parliament demanded accountability, and the public wanted answers about how such a disaster could have occurred. When one of his ministers described it as the worst naval defeat in centuries, Churchill cut him off and explained what actual disaster would have looked like, describing 3 German battleships prowling the Atlantic and sinking convoys and tying down 20 capital ships hunting them, stating that what happened represented embarrassment and humiliation, but that those ships were now in Germany bottled up and neutralized and would spend the rest of the war in Norwegian fjords, achieving precisely nothing of strategic value. Churchill acknowledged that the public saw what happened without seeing what didn't happen, missing the convoys that would now get through unmolested, and the battleships that could be deployed elsewhere, and the strategic calculation that turned apparent defeat into actual victory. The technical specifications of the 3 German capital ships that executed this audacious operation reveal the formidable nature of the forces that the British were attempting to stop, with Scharnhorst and Gneisenau representing the Kriegsmarine's most modern battle cruisers, displacing 32,000 tons at standard load and nearly 39,000 tons at full load, with main armament consisting of 9 11-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, providing devastating firepower against surface targets. The secondary armament included 12 5.9-inch guns and 14 4.1-inch anti-aircraft guns, along with numerous smaller caliber weapons, creating layered defenses that could engage aircraft at various ranges, while the armor protection included a 13-inch belt along the waterline and deck armor, ranging from 2 to 4 inches, providing substantial protection against bombs and shells. The propulsion systems used 3 sets of geared steam turbines, generating 160,000 shaft horsepower from 12 high-pressure boilers, providing maximum speeds of 32 knots that made these battlecruisers among the faster capital ships in any navy, and allowing them to outrun most opponents they couldn't outfight. Prinz Eugen, by contrast, was a heavy cruiser, displacing 14,000 tons at standard load, with main armament of 8 8-inch guns in 4 twin turrets and secondary armament of 12 4.1-inch anti-aircraft guns, protected by armor belt of 3 inches and deck armor of 2 inches, with propulsion generating 132,000 shaft horsepower, providing maximum speed of 32 knots, matching the battlecruisers she accompanied. The defensive escort that accompanied these 3 capital ships represented an unprecedented concentration of surface and air power for protecting a naval formation during transit through hostile waters, with 7 destroyers providing anti-submarine screening and surface combat capabilities, while 14 torpedo boats added additional firepower and flexibility for engaging smaller British vessels like motor torpedo boats that might attempt close-range attacks. The 25 minesweepers served the critical function of clearing paths through British defensive minefields that had been laid in the Channel to impede exactly this type of operation, using their sweeping gear to detonate or cut free mines before the capital ships reached areas where underwater explosives might damage or sink them. The air cover provided by 250 Luftwaffe fighters represented the largest sustained air defense operation the Luftwaffe had conducted over water up to that point, with Jagdgeschwader 2 and 26 providing experienced pilots flying Messerschmitt Bf-109F fighters and Focke-Wulf FW-190A fighters that were among the best-performing aircraft available to any air force in 1942. The rotating patrol system ensured that approximately 40 fighters were always overhead at any given time, with fresh aircraft arriving every 30 minutes to relieve those whose fuel was running low, creating continuous coverage that prevented British bombers from approaching unmolested and forced them to fight through defensive screens before reaching attack positions. The Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers that led the British attacks represented obsolete technology by 1942 standards, having first flown in 1934 and been designed for operations from aircraft carriers against lightly defended targets, with their fabric-covered biplane design and maximum speed of 90 knots, making them extraordinarily vulnerable to modern fighters and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, who led the Swordfish attack, understood the mission's suicidal nature, but accepted it because naval tradition and military duty required pressing home attacks regardless of odds, and his posthumous Victoria Cross recognized courage that inspired admiration even among those who questioned whether sending obsolete aircraft against heavily defended modern warships represented sound tactical judgment. The individual stories of pilots and crew members who participated in the attacks reveal extraordinary courage and determination in face of overwhelming defensive firepower, with bomber crews pressing attacks despite watching other aircraft being shot down around them, and torpedo bomber pilots maintaining straight and level flight during final attack runs when they were most vulnerable to defensive fire, because deviating from course would cause torpedoes to miss their targets. The Beaufort torpedo bomber crews demonstrated particular courage during their attacks because these aircraft lacked the speed to escape quickly after launching weapons and had to maintain attack heading for precious seconds after release, while defensive fire concentrated on them with deadly accuracy. The German defensive tactics evolved throughout the day as attacks continued, with the squadron learning to time evasive maneuvers to coincide with bomb releases and coordinating turns among all ships simultaneously to maintain formation integrity while reducing hit probability for attacking aircraft. The Luftwaffe fighters developed tactics specifically for defending the squadron against British attacks, including positioning combat air patrols up-sun from expected attack directions and using altitude advantage to dive on British formations before they could organize coordinated strikes, with German pilots achieving remarkable success rates that reflected both superior aircraft performance and tactical expertise developed through years of combat experience. The communication failures that plagued British operations throughout the day resulted partly from incompatible radio systems between different services, and partly from inadequate procedures for coordinating multi-service operations against rapidly moving targets, with RAF squadrons often receiving outdated position information by the time they reached attack areas, and Royal Navy vessels lacking real-time updates about air operations that might have allowed better coordination of surface and air attacks. The radar systems available in 1942 provided limited tracking capabilities compared to later wartime developments, with coverage gaps along portions of the channel, allowing the German squadron to pass through areas where British radar couldn't detect them, and creating situations where visual sighting was the only means of determining enemy positions. The weather conditions that prevailed during much of February 12th proved decisive in preventing British attacks from achieving concentration necessary for overwhelming German defences, with cloud cover and reduced visibility causing bomber formations to fragment and individual aircraft or small groups to attack independently rather than in the massed formations that might have saturated defensive fire. The German meteorologists who advised on timing for the operation had predicted these conditions with remarkable accuracy based on weather patterns they had observed developing days earlier, demonstrating that superior weather forecasting contributed significantly to operational success by ensuring the squadron would transit the Channel during a period when British air attacks would be hindered by atmospheric conditions. The mine strikes that damaged Scharnhorst twice and Gneisenau once during the final hours of the transit resulted from British defensive minefields that had been laid months earlier to impede exactly this type of operation, with the mines being acoustic and magnetic types that detected ships through sound signatures and magnetic field distortions, rather than requiring physical contact. The fact that these mines achieved the only significant damage inflicted on the German squadron demonstrated that defensive minefields represented more effective barriers to naval transits than air or surface attacks when those attacks were poorly coordinated and executed piecemeal against heavily defended targets. The damage sustained by Scharnhorst from the two mine strikes required extensive repair work in German dockyards that removed her from operations for approximately 3 months, creating an ironic situation where British mines achieved more operational impact than all the aircraft and surface vessels committed to stopping the Channel Dash by rendering one of the capital ships temporarily unavailable for combat missions. Gneisenau's mine damage was less severe, but still required dockyard repairs that consumed resources and time, while Prinz Eugen emerged from the operation essentially undamaged and immediately available for continued operations, though her subsequent deployment to Norway meant she would see limited combat action for the remainder of the war. The strategic reorientation of German naval forces toward Norway following the Channel Dash reflected Hitler's increasing obsession with defending Norwegian territory against potential Allied invasion, and his belief that Allied convoys to Murmansk represented critical targets that justified concentrating powerful naval forces in northern waters. Admiral Raeder's opposition to this reorientation was based on his understanding that Atlantic convoy routes represented more valuable targets, and that dispersing limited German naval strength between multiple theaters reduced effectiveness in all areas. But Hitler's strategic vision prevailed despite professional naval advice suggesting alternative approaches would better serve German interests. The Battle of North Cape in December 1943, where Scharnhorst was sunk by HMS Duke of York and accompanying destroyers, demonstrated the futility of maintaining powerful capital ships in Norwegian waters, where they rarely engaged in meaningful operations, with Scharnhorst's final sortie against an Arctic convoy resulting in her destruction by British forces that had been specifically positioned to intercept her based on ultra-intelligence derived from decoded German radio communications. The loss of Scharnhorst represented the end of German surface threat in northern waters and validated British strategic assessment that the Channel Dash had ultimately benefited Allied interests by removing German capital ships from positions where they could effectively threaten vital convoys. The propaganda dimensions of Operation Cerberus proved complex and multifaceted, with both sides attempting to control narrative about what the operation meant strategically and politically, with German propaganda emphasizing the tactical brilliance and successful execution while minimizing discussion of strategic implications, and British propaganda initially struggling to explain how such a humiliating tactical defeat could be reconciled with claims of overall naval superiority. Churchill's private assessment that the operation represented strategic victory despite tactical defeat took months to gain traction in public discourse because the immediate visual impact of German ships sailing through British waters created powerful psychological effects that were difficult to counter through abstract strategic arguments. The parliamentary debates following the Channel Dash revealed deep concerns about Royal Navy readiness and inter-service coordination, with members of Parliament questioning whether adequate preparations had been made for contingencies like enemy capital ships attempting channel transits, and whether command structures were appropriate for modern combined operations, requiring coordination between naval and air forces. The official inquiry conducted by Admiral Ramsay provided detailed analysis of what had gone wrong and offered recommendations for improving coordination and reconnaissance and response procedures, with many of those recommendations being implemented in subsequent months and contributing to better performance in later combined operations. The lessons learned from the Channel Dash influenced Allied planning for subsequent amphibious operations, including the eventual Normandy invasion, where coordination between naval and air forces would prove critical to success, with planners studying the failures of February 12th to identify weaknesses in command and control systems and communication procedures that needed to be addressed before attempting large-scale combined operations against defended shores. The recognition that poor coordination had allowed 3 German capital ships to escape despite overwhelming British numerical superiority in aircraft and surface vessels drove reforms in operational planning and execution that would benefit Allied forces throughout the remainder of the war. The human cost of the operation extended beyond immediate casualties to include psychological trauma affecting survivors who had watched friends and comrades die in attacks that achieved no tangible results, creating a sense of futility and waste that affected morale in squadrons that participated in the failed attacks. The Royal Navy's tradition of aggressive action, regardless of odds, was tested by the Channel Dash, because while courage had been displayed abundantly by pilots and sailors who pressed home attacks against overwhelming defenses, the lack of coordination and proper planning meant that individual acts of courage couldn't compensate for systemic failures in intelligence and operational coordination. The commemoration of Eugene Esmond and the Swordfish crews who died attacking the German squadron included posthumous Victoria Crosses and other decorations that recognized extraordinary valor, while simultaneously raising questions about whether command decisions that sent obsolete aircraft against modern, heavily defended warships represented appropriate use of limited resources and brave men. The balance between honoring courage and learning from tactical mistakes remained difficult to strike, because acknowledging systemic failures in planning and coordination risked appearing to diminish the sacrifices made by those who died following orders that sent them into situations where survival was nearly impossible. The long-term historical assessment of Operation Cerberus has generally concluded that while the operation represented tactical brilliance and successful execution by German forces, the strategic implications favored Allied interests by removing powerful German surface ships from Atlantic convoy routes where they had tied down disproportionate British naval resources. The paradox of winning a battle while losing strategic position reflected broader patterns in German wartime strategy, where tactical successes often came at cost of strategic positioning, and where Hitler's interference in operational planning frequently produced outcomes that professional military officers had warned against, and he concluded that history would judge the operation differently from contemporary reactions because Hitler had removed his most dangerous pieces from the board, winning a battle, while Britain won something far more valuable by securing Hitler's strategic mistake that would benefit Allied operations throughout the remainder of the war.